Hello everyone. Good morning for some of you. Good afternoon. Good evening. This is the magic of Zoom. We are stretching time and space. Zoom is really a sort of new tool of time-space compressor. This is quite amazing. For the one who do not know us, my name is Louise Lemoine. I'm a diploma tutor at the AA and Diploma 16, and I run this unit together with my partner Beka and Gili Merin, who is here at the airport. She's currently traveling. We are very pleased to welcome you all today to this first session of our new open seminar that we entitled Sensitive Observation Seminar Series. The seminar will host during the year a series of guests from different fields, architects, photographers, filmmakers, artists, philosophers, writers, anthropologists, and other outsiders of categories, who will discuss with us their own practice, their research, and their working methodology. So in close relation to our unit's studio work and production of films, the seminar will attempt to define what sensitive observation means in order to enlighten the social, the political, and poetical importance of such practices within architectural education and our profession at large. So today, on behalf of the AA School and our Diploma 16 unit, we are extremely pleased to welcome our first guest of the year, Daniell. But before starting with the lecture, I would like to briefly introduce our guest. Daniell is currently Professor of Architectural Theory and Criticism at Kyoto University and is an expert of contemporary Japanese architecture. He holds 2 bachelor's degrees from Victoria University in New Zealand and a master's from Kyoto University, a PhD from RMIT in Melbourne, Australia. As an educator, he was the head of the architecture department in the University of St. Joseph in Macau. As a researcher, he was a fellow at the CCA in Montreal and numerous societies of architecture historians in Australia and New Zealand. He was awarded 2 publication grants from the Graham Foundation, a second place in the Gerd Becker Prize of Architectural Criticism, and a commendation in the Sika Pierre Vago Awards. He's the author of numerous books, among which Foba Buildings and After the Crash, Architecture in Post-Bubble Japan, that were published by Princeton Architectural Press in 2005 and 2008. But his most recent book is An Anatomy of Influence that you can see here, a wonderful book that was published by actually AA Publications in 2008. Thomas is also a frequent contributor to AA Files. But on a more personal note, let's say that we met Thomas a couple of years ago while we were living in Japan. And he very generously organized a small retrospective of our films with Kiyoshise Takeyama at the Museum of Modern Art in Kyoto. And we actually remember a memorable dinner after the talks with an exquisite sake with golden leaves. And that's one of our best memories of dinners in Japan. So let's say to come back to a more serious topic, in perfect line with the seminar's intention, that is to define what can be sensitive observation in the urban, Thomas will present us today an historical overview of the genealogy of Japanese street observers from the 1920s to today. On a logistical note, I would like to ask every one of you to keep your microphones off during the lecture, while afterwards all questions will be very welcome. So Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation to be here. It's really a pleasure to participate. And this is our world now, where we are all over the world without traveling. We just Zoom to wherever we need to be. So, understanding your intentions with this studio, this diploma unit at the AA, I will talk about the history of observing street objects and mundane objects in Japan, because I think that finding beauty in the mundane, or more precisely finding the mundane to be beautiful, is a constant theme in the history of Japanese aesthetics that goes back at least as far as the 16th century tea ceremony innovator Senno Rikyū, who invented the tea ceremony as it's known today. Prior to Rikyū, the tea ceremony was a luxurious event that took place in an elaborately decorated room with servants preparing tea in ornate porcelain cups and other utensils, usually imported from China. Rikyū was the tea advisor to Hideyoshi, who was the warlord who unified Japan, and once had a tea ceremony room built lined with gold leaf and red silk. So in opposition to that, Rikyū invented what's known as the Wabicha Tea Ceremony, held in a humble room that looks like a hermit's hut, in which the host serves the tea using ordinary unglazed ceramic cups. So the cups and the whisks and so on were not specially made. They just found objects chosen with care and taste. So by rejecting the expensive tea utensils used by the wealthy in favor of imperfect everyday objects, I think that Rikyū fostered a sensitivity to the poetics of the prosaic that's central to Japanese culture even today. In the architectural world, the close observation of mundane buildings and urban spaces or objects begins, I think, with the work of Wajirō Kon, who was an architecture professor at Waseda University, but he spent much of his career documenting the behaviors and living environments of a rapidly modernizing and westernizing Japanese society. And he invented a new discipline that he called Modernology. So his early fieldwork was on vernacular dwellings in the countryside, but as well as looking at the architecture, he looked at people's possessions, how they stored them and how they used them, and thereby indirectly studied the behavior patterns of everyday life. Then, in 1923, Japan was hit, well, Tokyo was hit by a major earthquake, and Kon began to study the shelters built by the homeless survivors, which he described using the English word barracks or baraku. And these were demonstrations of true minimalism, the kind of shelters and possessions and behaviors that arise from having no resources at all. So he and a small group of artist friends formed what they called the Barrack Decoration Company, and they used paint and other ornamentation to try and give a more cheerful appearance to these pathetic shelters. And they were well aware of the relationship to Dadaist and Surrealist art. Now, his next phase of work was the birth of Modernology. Together with students and friends, he made precisely detailed drawings of various unusual, or more to the point, usual subjects. He noted the percentages of pedestrians wearing Western versus Japanese clothing. He itemized things that were for sale in a downtown shopping district. They observed the ways that people stored their possessions. They went into the homes of several newlywed couples and saw all of the things they had for their new lives. They then observed the sleeping positions of laborers on their lunch break in Tokyo, and they tracked the shortening skirts and consumer behavior of women in Tokyo's shopping districts. So this was all pioneering and serious work, but not without a sense of humor. They carefully documented the damage to high school boys' uniforms. They mapped the patterns of cracks in bowls in cheap cafeterias, and they even tracked the paths of ants walking within a 50-centimeter square. Now, these studies were published in various magazines, and they were exhibited during the 1920s, then all collected into a book called Modernology, co-authored by Kon and an artist friend, Kinkichi Yoshida. And the work was hugely popular, and it inspired many other people over the following decades to do similar work. And a lot of it was very obviously architecturally related. So, for example, in 1954, there was an album published called Ginza Hacho, which contained photographs of every building on the main avenue in the Ginza neighborhood, but bound so it could unfold in a continuous image about 4 meters long, like a traditional illustrated scroll. And it comprises about 200 photographs taken over a 6-month period with the same camera angle, the same time of day. And the photos inevitably capture some interesting historical moments that would otherwise have been lost. So there's a photo of the first, the billboard advertising Japan's first widescreen film, or you discover that, for example, the site of the famous Mitsukoshi department store was once occupied by a tobacco shop. So the work of Wajirō Kon, as it related to the idea of a found object or a ready-made, was also of great interest to the artist Genpei Akasegawa. The entire story of Akasegawa's very interesting career is told in his very interesting memoir called Full Confession. In the 1960s, Akasegawa was a founding member of an artist group called the Neo-Dadaism Organizers, who staged various bizarre performances in galleries in Tokyo, but also in the streets. And he personally became famous for a series of artworks that incorporated obviously fake 1,000-yen notes. The first one was a mailed invitation to a 1963 exhibition of his work, but they later appeared in various forms and sizes. And the police at that time were searching for real counterfeiters, so they took Akasegawa in for questioning and they charged him with counterfeiting. He refused to plead guilty they offered just a small fine and it would all be forgotten, but he refused to do that. So this forced a trial. So the police had to collect all of the different artworks he created using fake 1,000-yen notes as evidence for the trial. And then on the first day, Akasegawa brought in all of his artist friends to stage a neo-Dadaist happening in the courtroom as part of the case for the defense. And he explained the artistic reuse of common objects in the ready-mades of Marcel Duchamp, or the appropriation of common images, such as the flags in Jasper Johns' paintings. The judge wasn't convinced. There was a 4-year trial, after which Akasegawa received a 3-month suspended sentence, but also national fame as an anti-authoritarian prankster. There were many follow-up publications and symposiums, and all of this radically altered social attitudes toward freedom of speech and expression in Japan. Now, soon afterwards, he was invited to teach at a newly founded alternative art school called Bêka, which was a very strange and experimental place. And he used the opportunity to revive modernology, to engage his students in studies of all kinds of trivia and everyday objects, including what would eventually become known as Thomassons. Now, the idea of the Thomasson emerged from Akasegawa's increasing irritation with conceptual art. He liked to point out random objects on the street and mock seriously describe them as if they were important artworks. But then sometime in 1972, he discovered this stair near where he was based in Tokyo. And the stair goes nowhere. Obviously, at some point there had been a door at the landing, but it was now blocked. But not only had the stair been kept, it had recently been repaired. So Akasegawa decided that this was a profound new genre of art, and he named this art form Chōgeijutsu, which you could translate as either hyper art or ultra art. And over the next few months, he collected a few more examples of, for example, a gate that has been kept, even though it doesn't open anymore. And he later decided to call them Thomassons, in ironic homage to the American baseball player Gary Thomasson. Thomasson was hired by the Tokyo Giants on a huge salary, but he hardly ever managed to hit the ball. So Akasegawa thought he was the perfect metaphor for hyperart, a useless thing that was being expensively maintained, though he was careful to say that he had nothing at all against Gary Thomasson, the person. So Akasegawa's classes at Bêka became what he called the Thomasson Observation Center, where his students would go out and look for interesting things in the streets. And he would publish the most interesting ones in a column he wrote for Super Photo magazine every month. And he also invited readers of the magazine to send in their own Thomassons that they might have found. And if Akasegawa decided to publish one of them, he very mischievously would reward the contributor with a 0-yen note of his own making, because he couldn't be arrested for passing worthless currency if it announced that it was worthless. Though if you have one of these now, they're worth a lot of money. Akasegawa also sorted the Thomassons into interesting, provocative categories and collected them all in a book. The book is originally in Japanese, but there's also an excellent English translation available as well of all the collected articles. So the categories included, for example, Eve's Thomassons, which were projections that sheltered nothing, or boundary Thomassons, which were fences that separated nothing. Castella Thomassons were unidentifiable lumps like pieces of cake. Atomic Thomassons were the traces of something that had been removed, that usually an adjacent building, that evoked the shadows imprinted on walls after a nuclear blast. And the Sada Abe Thomasson was a truncated object that was usually a telephone pole or something, named for an infamous Japanese woman who had severed her lover's genitalia with a kitchen knife, and so on. Now, the 60s through to the early 70s was in fact a very intense period of fieldwork on Tokyo's everyday built environment by many, many people, not just the Thomasson Observation Center. And I think all of this work, which was quite scholarly, was triggered by a special issue of Kenshiku Bunka magazine in 1963, which was anonymously guest edited by Arata Isozaki and the historian Teiji Ito. And most of what was inspired by this was quite serious scholarly fieldwork, but some groups of students began to develop more unconventional approaches to their surroundings, doing what they called, in English, design surveys. So their interest was in actions rather than objects, in symbolism rather than substance, and in the empirical phenomenological experience of the city around them. So for example, the Konpeito group, which the name doesn't mean anything, it's the name of a type of candy in Japan, was 3 students from the Tokyo University of the Arts who were fascinated with everyday banality. They would, for example, map every detail of a single shopping arcade. They would give equal status to fixed building components and temporary elements like signboards and sunshades. Or the Iryuhin Kinkyujo, which you would translate as the Lost Items Research Institute, were 4 students from Arata Isozaki's seminar at Musashino University who saw themselves as police detectives. They would use discarded objects as clues to profile the perpetrators of the city. And their leader, Tomoharu Makabe, later became famous for his charcoal rubbings of wall textures and floor surfaces, ground surfaces, which he called urban frottage. Now, around this time, Terunobu Fujimori was pursuing a doctorate in architectural history at the University of Tokyo. But in 1974, he and a fellow student began to explore Tokyo in search of old Western-style buildings. And they found extraordinary buildings that had never been recorded in any history book. But they also found famous buildings that no one knew were still standing, that they'd become dilapidated or modified beyond immediate recognition. So Fujimori wrote articles about these buildings for popular magazines with a literary yet colloquial tone and self-deprecating humor. He coined the name Architectural Detective Agency for the magazine articles. Now, Fujimori and Akasegawa had never met, but obviously they were destined to. They were on paths that were sure to meet. And in 1985, they were finally introduced to each other by the editor Tetsuo Matsuda, who was at that time working on a book about both of them. And he tells the entire story of that period in his memoir, The Era of Editorial Insanity. And having got together, they then searched out 2 other people that had caught their attention, who they felt were working along similar lines or had similar interests. One was Joji Hayashi, who was a writer who famously spent many, many years walking around Japan and Europe, taking thousands of photographs of manhole covers and various other strange things that he stumbled upon. And he found the most trivial things worthy of attention. So he would collect the pebbles that lodged in his shoes each day. He'd put them in small bottles, carefully dated. He would glue train ticket chads into albums, also with dates and locations. And he kept a diary of his flatulence. He would invent onomatopoeias to notate the precise sounds. The other person was Tsutomu Ichiki, who was a dentist who used his free time to travel around Japan collecting fragments from demolished buildings, both famous and anonymous. Like a kind of Japanese John Soane, he was amassing a huge collection of mementos. So as this group was starting to come together, what would eventually become the ROJO group, an art magazine called Geijutsu Shincho commissioned them all to take a trip to Kyoto and indulge all of their personal obsessions with Thomassons and old buildings and manhole covers and pebbles and so on. And the Kyoto research was then published in the magazine and later became a book called Kyoto Omoshiro Watching. And they decided this was a good chance to create a more official group, a more formal, ongoing group. So they first thought they would call themselves the Modernologists, but then Fujimori suggested maybe we should call ourselves the ROJO Kansatsu Club. ROJO Kansatsu means street observation. And the others said, nice idea, but wouldn't it be funnier if we called ourselves the ROJO Kansatsu Gakkai, which means the Street Observation Society, with the nuance of a learned, serious academic council. And they're now known as ROJO for short. So they collected all of their previous work over the last decade or so into a book they called The Introduction to Street Observation Studies. And as street observers, they decided that the book launch should be on the street. And as an academic society, it should be on the street in front of the prestigious Academy Hall in Tokyo. So they all dressed up in tailcoats, and Fujimori recited the founding declaration to a group of friends and students and journalists. And then in the early years of their existence, ROJO conducted fieldwork in the 23 districts of central Tokyo. Each expedition would last several days, during which they would all stay together in the same hotel. In the morning, they'd meet in the lobby. Fujimori would give a brief lecture on the history of the local area, then use a map to divide it up into parcels for each member of the group. And they split up during the day to explore alone, then had their slides developed in the late afternoon. This is, of course, before there was smartphones and digital photography. And then in the evenings, they would get together and share their discoveries at kind of impromptu slideshows that went on until very late at night or the early hours of the morning in increasingly drunken hilarity. And they competed to invent names for the things they had discovered. So the members of ROJO would look but not touch. They would just photograph and name their finds while leaving them for the rest of the world to rediscover or destroy. And they thereby accumulated a valuable documentation of aspects of the city that tend to be both unnoticed and short-lived, because most of ROJO's discoveries have long since disappeared. The height of their activities coincided with the late 1980s economic bubble, during which Tokyo's ancient and recent past was being thoughtlessly destroyed as a consequence of the availability of huge amounts of investment capital. So ROJO's photographs from that period comprise a literally irreplaceable archive of ephemera made permanent. So if the physical city can be seen as a kind of sedimentation of historical processes and events, ROJO was looking for the misalignments, the rough edges, the overlaps, and the leftovers, the things that slip through the cracks, but also the formation of the cracks themselves. And by capturing trivia and focusing on things that other people ignore, the mundane could become sublime. But ROJO photographs are not the same as Thomasson photographs. Thomasson objects are defined by the deliberate effort being made to preserve something that's no longer functional. But ROJO objects are the result of negligence, and in some cases, they need no human intervention at all. And in fact, Fujimori says that anything deliberately designed to be amusing doesn't really qualify to be included in the ROJO collection. But what connects ROJO photos and Thomasson photos is the laughter they cause in the street observers and their audience. And there's no cynicism in this laughter. They're just a kind of admiration of these objects, a wonder at their survival, and a joy in all this useless beauty. So in fact, perhaps the most important activity of ROJO was not the discovery and documentation of weird objects. It was the invention of witty names for them. And the desire to invent quirky names for overlooked urban phenomena continues today in the practice of Atelier Bow-Wow, architects who began their careers with field work that openly emulated the work of ROJO. They graduated in the aftermath of the economic bubble, and they wanted to document that aftermath. So the book Made in Tokyo shows the extraordinary combinations of activities that overlap and intersect due to the hyperdense development and the maximization of available land. And the subsequent book, which is called Pet Architecture, looks at basically the same topic, but from a different angle. They documented all of the tiny buildings that were being put on every available scrap of super expensive land, and they found these extraordinary wedges and slivers of buildings. So Atelier Bow-Wow and their collaborators have continued to document the forms and spaces of the post-bubble Japanese city, as well as the small but vital elements of architecture, such as windows and walls. But they also follow Wajirō Kon's practice of emphasizing the relationships between architecture and the behavior of the users. So what they like to call behaviorology, or architectural behaviorology, is of course a nod to Kon. But unlike ROJO, the work of Atelier Bow-Wow uses these studies as the basis or the intellectual framework for their design projects, which puts them outside the lineage of pure observers. So Fujimori considers them not really to be part of the legacy of ROJO and Kon. According to Fujimori, the contemporary figure who's closest in spirit to ROJO would be the journalist, photographer, writer, and editor Kyoichi Suzuki, with his photographic portfolios of kitsch theme parks and tawdry roadside attractions and tacky souvenirs and cramped apartments and love hotels and various other ridiculous, humorous elements to be found in Japan. And more recently, he has gone outside Japan to document similar stuff in Europe. But to talk of successors, in fact, the ROJO group never broke up. They, even though some of the members have since passed away, this amazing merger of personalities and methodologies and obsessions have given the group an amazing resilience and range and influence. So a society that was invented as a joke persisted for more than 30 years, producing a vivid range of stream of books and exhibitions. This is just a small selection of the books they published over the years. Television shows, and they also inspired similar street observation groups all over Japan. And if you look on social media, on Facebook and Pinterest and Instagram and so on, you'll find many roadside observation groups and Thomasson observation groups in Japan, and I guess elsewhere in the world. But Fujimori insists that ROJO, the ROJO group, has no deeper purpose or message. It's just the hobby of a few more or less eccentric individuals who take a more or less ironic enjoyment in the subtle strangeness of the world around them. It's like bird watching or train spotting without a checklist, or hunting for clues in the absence of a crime. But despite what Fujimori says, I think there is a connection with the notion of the ready-made or the found object that does link the 16th century tea master Sen no Rikyu to the 20th century artist Marcel Duchamp and onto the Thomassons and the work of ROJO. So Fujimori, as an architectural historian, is an expert on the architecture of Rikyu, and Akasegawa wrote or co-wrote a movie screenplay about his life. And after that, he then wrote a book about Rikyu, which compares Rikyu to Duchamp. The book's called Mugon no Zen, the wordless avant-garde. He thinks that Rikyu and Duchamp were working in similar ways with the notion of the ready-made and the found object. But he also, interestingly, in the book, he asserts that the Thomasson is a Japanese phenomenon, because he believes that the Western countries would not permit that level of, that kind of ambiguity to exist. But aside from found objects and ready-mades, Tetsuo Matsuda, another of the founding members of the ROJO group, believes that the closest art historical principle would be Marcel Duchamp's notion of the inframans, the ultra-thin, which are phenomena that are almost but not quite below the threshold of substance and perception. So Duchamp said that the ultra-thin can't be defined, it can only be illustrated. So it's tobacco smoke that contains the scent of the mouth that exhaled it, it's the warmth of a recently vacated seat, it's the sound of trouser legs rubbing together, it's the differences between two objects mass-produced from the same mold, or, for example, the same object re-examined 1 second later. So with a similar attention to all of the tiny subtleties, of Japanese material culture, part sociology and part archaeology. All of this work, I think, is essentially a curation of the urban environment. It's a mode of selection, because a ready-made is, as Duchamp himself said, it's less a found object than it is a chosen object. And as Roland Barthes noted in his famous and influential book on Japan, The Empire of Signs, Tokyo as a city has to be understood through walking and seeing. So I think that the work of Wajirō Kon and all of his successors, the Lost Items Research Institute, the Thomasson Observation Center, the Architectural Detective Agency, and the Street Observation Society, Atelier Bow-Wow, and many, many others, and it still continues today. It's all a reminder of the inexhaustible richness of the everyday world that's hidden in plain sight, and the pleasures to be gained from just looking. So I'll finish there, and we can talk about any of the work that I showed.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Thomas.
It's such a fascinating journey through the work of very inspiring, I don't know, how would I call them, artist-architect or architect-artists that really invite us to refine our skills of observation of these ultra-thin, ultra-mince phenomena and elements of our daily urban environments. Let's say that this is something we try also to do in our unit here at the AA, but in a slightly different way, a little bit more, we call this Homo Urbanus, because we feel a little bit closer to Wajirō Kon's Modernology in that sense. We try to really observe the city in relation to the way we use it and people, yeah. But maybe we can open to questions. To all of you are invited to ask questions to Thomas, to go maybe a bit deeper in some of the elements he discussed. Do you want to say something?
I was impressed by, I know a little bit the work by ROJO, Wajirō Kon, and all of these observers of the street. And I was always impressed by the humor they have, because it's a really fundamental, the humor. So they have a lot of humor. And having lived in Japan for 6 months, we can find this kind of humor a little bit in the culture, in the Japanese culture. I was curious to know, but because you live in Japan, you know very well the Japanese culture. How do you relate the humor they have with the humor that you can find every day in the culture? What is for you typically Japanese? There's a typical Japanese humor in what they have, or is just because they had fun because they had a lot of fun, to make this book, this observation is what we feel about this work.
They did. They did it because they found it funny and amusing, and other people did too. That's why they were so successful and popular. I think this kind of work, this discovery of tiny incongruous things, is very appealing to the Japanese mentality, let's say. So I mean, it's always risky to make general comments, but there's a whole kind of stream of humor in Japan that I could have showed more. It came out a little bit in the work of Kyoichi Tsuzuki, perhaps, where it's a kind of a slightly vulgar humor. And particularly in the Japanese countryside, outside the big cities, you find a great love of dirty jokes, jokes about bodily functions and so forth. And I think there's an undercurrent of that in the work of these street observers. There's something a little bit childlike about it, that just kind of enjoys dirty jokes and silly events. So Japan's a culture that there's a very great difference between public face and private face, let's say. So things seem very, very orderly and calm and relatively emotionless in many public negotiations, but once you're in the karaoke bar and everyone's had a couple of drinks, it's absolutely hilarious conversations. And you know this too. I we had the wonderful dinner you mentioned, which turned into a very entertaining conversation. So I think that there is a love of every day as in an aesthetic sense, which I hope I showed, dating all the way back to the 15th century and 16th century, but that obviously can't be separated from the sense of humor as well. The sense of beauty and the sense of humor are related at a deep level.
Maybe just to follow this, I'm personally interested also in the interrelation in between this genealogy of street observers you mentioned and the Western culture. You mentioned how at the start they have been influenced also by important figures such as Marcel Duchamp and let's say Dada spirit and the influence of surrealism in this, which set this iconoclastic tone in a certain way. But would you say that they have been also a sort of reversed influence of those approaches and practices into Western culture? I'm particularly interested in what Ila said of this humoristic tonality or spirit and the taste of these very subtle strangeness of daily life. Because we can obviously think right away of the situationist and the psychogeographic movement, but I'm wondering, how do you see any correlations or of similarities with Western culture in some ways?
Well, there are many parallels, and I've always tried to bring out those parallels. And sometimes they're legitimate, and sometimes it's guesswork on my part, and sometimes it's denied by the artists and architects themselves. So an obvious reference for Fujimori would have been Venturi and Scott Brown's research on Las Vegas, and the ugly and the ordinary, and Main Street is almost okay. But I asked him about that, and he said when he began the architectural detective agency, he'd never heard of Venturi. They weren't at all an inspiration. You can find obvious parallels in the work of some artists, such as Irving Penn, the photographer, who took photographs of cigarette butts and all kinds of trash, was perhaps an influence. But these things kind of arise in parallel. I think your question is asking whether the Japanese people we're talking about took influences from the West, but then gave influences back to the West. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
So in fact, whether they give influences back to the West or not, I'm exactly the wrong person to answer that question. I'm here in Japan. I know all about one direction, but in fact, it's other people outside Japan who should answer that question for me.
Yeah, but we'll look for it. But because we find a lot of investigators and observers of the urban world, but rarely with that witty and humoristic spirit, which is really one of the characteristic of the genealogy you showed us.
There's a very famous critic or historian of Japanese poetry called Toru Haga, I think is his name. Basically a historian of haiku. And when he discovered what the ROJO group were doing, sitting in around looking at slides of funny objects and thinking up names for them, he said, what you're doing is exactly like pre-modern haiku parties, where the aristocracy would sit around drinking sake and try and invent haiku on the spot. So there are various links with Japanese tradition that can be made.
I had another question that for something that for us is very interesting. Yes, watching all these observers, we, as Louise said, we miss terribly the people, no? Because we are just watching a lot of very interesting things about the city, but about the buildings, about what is the constructor world. And we maybe adjust a little bit. Wajirō Kon was really interested in also observing people and so observing also the society. But otherwise, yeah, we miss terribly. So I was thinking about in your study, in your sort of research, which kind of part do you think that could also add the field of photography? Because in photography, for example, the street photography, I'm thinking to Daido Moriyama or even the beginning of Araki. There's a very big school of street photography in Japan. And in that film, they are only interested in people. It really is completely the opposite of what we are watching now. But I think they are really they go together because it's a kind of observation of the street, and the street is what is built, and what also the people, how the people live inside there. I'm sure, because I've seen also other lecture by you, and I know that you know very well because you talked already about also street photography.
Yes, I mean, if I gave this lecture in a longer version, I would certainly branch off into the photography of Moriyama and Araki, and even someone like Takashi Honma, I think, owes a certain depth to the earlier studies of everyday scenes. And it's true that the work of someone like Moriyama is focused on the activities of people or animals in many cases. But I guess the issue that all of this work is kind of making is that nothing can be separated. The behaviors of the people and the very, very ephemeral effects and traces of the city are just as important, or deserve just as much as attention as the substantial parts of the city that are going to last a much longer time. So I don't think you would split them so much into the work looking at objects and the work looking at people, so much as see it as all kind of a phenomenologically interrelated study of everything that happens in the atmosphere and the substance of the city.
In a sense, they use the same medium, no? They take photographs, both. Yes. Photographs. So there's a really strong relationship.
They're turning ephemeral things into something permanent. They're capturing a moment, and photography is, of course, the best way to do that.
Mm.
We would like to open the discussion also to all our participants. Is anyone wanting to ask a question or say a comment about the lecture? It's intended to be a unit seminar, so the spirit is really to also open the discussion. So I really encourage you to take part to it. In particular way, our students.
You are obliged. It's mandatory. Are you also a street observer, Thomas?
Aren't we all?
Are you take photographs? You have
I do. It's so easy now. I have my smartphone and I'm constantly taking photographs.
Yeah, and this is also something very interesting because I think in that moment when they took photographs, we didn't have the social media, but now you can find a lot of this kind of observation in social media everywhere, in Instagram or even other apps. So there is something really popular, no? This kind of observation.
Yes, it is. I was going to suggest that if there are people wanting to ask questions, they could send something to you in the chat function of Zoom, and then you could, to stop everyone talking at once or not knowing when to speak, you could then select who.
Yeah, but I think you can, put the sign of your hand or open your microphone once at a time and just ask a question.
There's a first question. Do you see the question?
No. Could you give me?
There's a question on chat that says, could you give examples of those names created during those meetings?
Yes.
Well, I showed about 30 or 40 slides of their photographs, and the captions in each case were the names they created at the meetings. But I translated them from Japanese.
Just to be sure that everyone has seen this caption, because in the other computer that we have, we didn't see the caption. So maybe we can ask if everyone has seen the caption. No? They've won. I have a question. Katerina.
Katerina, but you
go.
Hi.
Okay.
Hello. Yeah. Hi. Hello. Well, first of all, thank you very much. It was a fantastic and lovely lecture, and very informing, because I have to say that I didn't really know much of the sort of neo-Dadaist Japanese movement, and was fantastic. But, well, I mean, my question is more of a little bit of an observation, and I feel like as far as your conversation went in the last hour, like there was this constant like let's say like dialogue between you were like we were talking about this very sensitive people that were like constantly observing this dialogue there is between the space, its users, and the objects that they use, and how this constitutes a little bit like every like the most mundane, and how like a space is like none of the three dictate each other, but they're sort of like all of them in the same, doesn't make sense, like in the same sort of like field and platform. And I don't know, I was kind of like wondering and what would be kind of like your opinion on how this form of observing can transcend in the future? Like how do you see it moving forward as a sort of like as a, not a trend, but as a movement, or how, like how do you, where do you think it would continue, right? If we start informing our space like through the way we inhabit it, through the objects we have, through all of these things, like where could it maybe go forward? Does it make sense?
Well, perhaps I'm not understanding the question properly, but Fujimori and Akasegawa, they were very strict about just looking. They were observing, and it wasn't, because Fujimori became an architect after this, starting in the 90s. He was a historian most of his life, then he decided to start making architecture. And I would assume that most people have seen some of his architecture. It's very funny, interesting stuff. And I asked him if all of the Thomassons and the ROJO work had an influence on what he designed. And he said, absolutely not, it shouldn't. I said, are you hiding Thomassons in your buildings, for example? He said, no, they can't be intentional. And I don't use it as a basis for design. And that's why he rejects the work of Atelier Bow-Wow, even though he likes them and respects them, but he doesn't say they are a continuation of ROJO, precisely because they're using it to inform their work. They're using their studies of streets in the city to inform their work. So a pure lineage of what we're talking about here would just be, the direction it would go would be, we have more equipment and media. We now all have a smartphone in our pocket with 60 gigabytes of memory, and we can all taking 35 millimeter slides was slow and difficult and expensive back in those days. Now it costs you nothing. And the quality is much better. But then I guess we could expand that into other digital measuring devices where you can actually register things like ultraviolet and infrared and other things that are not visible to the naked eye can be now recorded. And then I guess one direction would be what's known as augmented reality, where certain artists create digital effects that can only be seen either with a tablet or with certain goggles, where you suddenly realize there are extra digital things in the space with you, and that's the artwork, the augmented reality. That would be one direction it might go in. Yeah,
true. And sorry, as you were speaking, I just you made me think of something as well. Like now, if we think about the sort of amount of data and information that we keep on collecting, almost without wanting to, right? As in, cataloging them becomes almost extremely important. Like being aware and seeing them, right? And like being aware of the amount of information, like let's say, like I don't like meta objects we keep on creating, like photos with the iPhone, like playlist on Spotify, God knows what likes I put on Instagram. Like I think maybe something that we should maybe all sort of like take from the Thomasson or the found objects, which at the end is like not object you find, but like you kind of like want to find, right? Like Duchamp said, maybe like
choose, yes.
Yeah, choose. Sorry. Like maybe becoming aware and starting cataloging or archiving all this information would be extremely interesting as well. Yeah, thank you.
I think I also have a question.
Sure.
You were showing the staircase without the door, and I was thinking that the one thing it's documented, but then the other thing it's asked why it happened. and which kind of behaviors are kind of brought this situation to life. Was it part of their research, and is it something you think about while you're being an observer in the city?
Yes, they in many cases trying to think backwards. They're trying to solve the crime, solve the what happened here. They wanted to deduce like a detective what situations and events might have led to what they found. But I don't think they ever actually tried to work out the reality. They just enjoyed speculating. And there are other, I had a short amount of time. There are many other groups who worked in similar ways. And particularly the Lost Items Research Institute, they tried to invent scenarios that might have led to what they found. And they didn't bother checking if those were the real scenarios. They just thought it was interesting to speculate.
Thank you.
We just received, Thomas, a question in the chat, if you're able to read it.
Would you please explain a bit about Fujimori's architecture? Are they also inspired by his street observation? Why would he choose to operate on a countryside-style architecture while he mostly observed urban oddities? You are so lucky to be able to speak. Okay, so Fujimori, I asked him explicitly, were you inspired in your architectural design work by the funny, interesting, weird things you were finding in the streets? And he said absolutely not. He was very clear that no. And they're different practices, and they're not connected. Now, even though an artist or an architect says something like that, you don't take them at face value. He denies any intellectual content to ROJO, and I think that's wrong. I think he's being a little bit disingenuous. And I think it's impossible for someone to have spent all of those years doing street observation and have it not have an effect on the design work they do later. So I think that in many cases, a critic or a historian understands the work better than the architect themselves. I think I once heard Jeffrey Kipner say that about Peter Eisenman. I know Eisenman's work better than he does. And I think there's some truth to that there's a kind of a psychoanalysis involved in studying work as a critic. So it's possible that even though Fujimori denies it, there will be aspects of the Thomasson and the ROJO in his design work. As to why he designs what you call countryside style architecture, I don't think that's really accurate. I know that what he says he wants to do is find a pre-cultural architecture. It's not old Japanese tradition. He wants to go back before there was any culture. There was just people building with the materials they had. And that involves avoiding technology and using materials that are available naturally. And the result, of course, because it's being built in Japan with locally available materials and local construction workers, it tends to look somehow Japanese, but it's not meant to be rural so much as to be primitive before culture and technology existed. In fact, the early buildings he built them together with the ROJO group. The ROJO group became his construction company, and they renamed themselves the Jomon Kenchikudan, which means the Jomon Construction Company. And Jomon is the Stone Age period of Japan. So they were the Stone Age Construction Company.
Wonderful.
It's really funny.
Any other questions?
Hi, good morning. I also have a question. Good morning from Portugal. Hi, Thomas.
Hi.
I was wondering, because you also say it during your inspiring and crazy, fantastic lecture, that this is a way of not looking outside, but looking inside Japan. So inside the cultural life of Japan. But I was thinking that as an architect, there's also this centered vision on the sociological or in the kind of contemporary cultural manifestations, but they are a way, or they are not interesting in the typical, in the cliche, in something that is repeated, but as anyone said in the chat, like a kind of a strange oddity, the unusual. How this is this somehow related with the tradition with the identification of Japanese culture through tradition, or it's like a looking inside, but just choosing what to look inside a country, inside the national culture?
I think it's it's a very interesting and very good question, but I think if you are inside, it's so difficult to know what you're doing. So a lot of Japanese architects will deny that their work has anything to do with tradition in their minds, but if you look at it as an observer, it's absolutely related to tradition. So it's not a question that, as an outsider myself, I'm kind of on the edge. I've been here so long, I'm somewhat inside Japan, but I'm still a guest, I'm still an outsider, and I'm still not Japanese. So it's definitely, I'm not in a position where I can make a definitive statement, and asking the architects themselves is not necessarily going to give you the true answer, even though it will be an honest answer. Often people don't never know their own motivations, let's say. So the relationship to tradition it's a huge ongoing debate within Japan about the influence of Westernization and the need to maintain tradition, and nobody has ever reached a conclusion about that. I'm sorry if that's not really answering the question.
Any other questions or comments? Don't be shy.
Hi, Thomas. Yes, I have a comment. I don't know if it'll turn into a question or maybe just a thought, and you can expand. Thank you for your lecture. I'm joining from Toronto, Canada, and it makes me kind of reflect on my own urban environment here and kind of the strange oddities. I mean, obviously having a cell phone, you're right. I think we all find ourselves as kind of urban like observers or kind of in our urban environments. But it makes me think also about kind of, at least to me, strange urban environments. I live closer to the city, but then you have the suburbs, and then you have the countryside, and then the suburbs for me are maybe I'm generalizing a bit, but they are kind of a strange in-between space between country and between city. And I don't think, at least at surface value, I don't think we would find this kind of similar oddities, maybe at least in the architecture, but this kind of copy-paste, repetitive, just housing architecture there. But then I think you would definitely find it in maybe the edits that people have done or are starting to do, or kind of little changes, or I guess what I'm getting at it is, could this be kind of like a little aspect of human nature, maybe that is coming out in either our built environment or our own actions within the environment? It's obviously seen city, like I haven't been to Tokyo, but in London you see it in the built environment a lot, with a lot of kind of building over other things, and about like layering, and about kind of these leftover spaces, these overlaps. So I think I see it everywhere around me, and I just wonder kind of what is that tying thread that it comes out in the different ways in environments that are so different from each other, right? The urban environments and cities. Just a thought that's kind of going through my head now.
Well, it's not really a question, though, is it? But I think
no.
The cities may be different, but human beings are human beings, and kind of a phenomenological understanding of the world tries to avoid all of the kind of cultural differences, and just work directly with human perception. And perhaps the simple fact that it's all we all share the same eyes to look at these things is the unifying feature.
Any other question? Oh, one is appearing in the chat. Did you get it? Did you get it?
Yes. So the question is, how are all these practices related with the ephemeral character of the city of Tokyo itself? The fact that the lifespan of a building is just 26 years and the city is constantly being rebuilt. What are the reflections of this genealogy related with time? So a very interesting topic. I hope I slightly addressed it during the presentation. One thing I should say about Tokyo, it is true that the lifespans of buildings can be very short, but in fact, it's the same buildings that are constantly being replaced, and certain other buildings last a very long time. There are buildings that have been in Tokyo for a century or centuries, and others that are less than 25 years old. So it's not like every building is constantly being replaced. There are kind of fixed anchors within the city in terms of public spaces and important buildings and infrastructure. And then there's a kind of a lighter kind of foam of buildings that are constantly being replaced. So I do think that ROJO, whether they intellectualized it or admitted it, it was a response to the fact that the city was changing so quickly that you could walk down a street you hadn't been down for a month and find it transformed by new developments or new apartment buildings or a new highway bypass or whatever. Things were being destroyed at such a tremendous pace. It was exciting. The city was very fresh and new. Lots of work for architects and lots of exciting architecture being built. There was this kind of nostalgic, romantic desire to capture the fragments of what was constantly disappearing. I think that was truly one of the motivations of ROJO. And so they began in 1986. They'd all been working independently for years before that, but 86 is when ROJO began. And that was also the moment that the bubble economy of Japan began. And that's when the demolition and reconstruction of the city really went into overdrive. And so the urgency of just trying to capture little kind of ephemeral fragments of the kind of the strange and surprising, beautiful moments in the city became urgent as well. And then the Atelier Bow-Wow that followed in the 1990s, that was a period of recession where the wave had crashed and receded, and suddenly they were looking at what was left over after a period of huge development and investment, and they were looking at the kind of like the ruins of the bubble and trying to document that. So in both cases, yes, it was absolutely related to the fact that the city changed so much, there was so much development going on, and they're both kind of ways of resisting being overwhelmed by that.
Hello, Daniel.
Yes.
I'm talking from Brazil. Thank you very much for the wonderful lecture. I would like to ask if any of these group go to the countries. Did they go to the countryside as well? If you go for example, for Portugal, the observation of the vernacular architecture was extremely important for the first modern architecture there. So I'd like to know if there was something like the other side of the coin, like the opposite of the modernology. What remained from the old cushions and the old architecture and design? Did they go there?
There's many groups, and so there's not one answer. But for example, the magazine I mentioned in 1963, edited by Arati Suzaki about Japanese urban space, a huge amount of that was not urban space. In fact, it was village space. He went and studied the traditional village forms, the way they formed along roads, and the way that they related to the mountains and the rice fields and the rivers. So there was a lot of study of vernacular dwellings. And although Fujimori and ROJO were mainly interested in Tokyo, the streets of the city, Bow-Wow have done a lot of their studies outside the main cities of Japan. They did some studies in a town called Kanazawa, looking at the traditional houses. They did a study in Kyoto of the old earth walls, of the earthen walls of temples in Kyoto. So there was a short amount of time today, but yeah, it's proportionally it's much more about the city, but certainly there is a lot of interest in vernacular dwellings. And a lot of these studies, the more serious academic studies that took place in the 70s and 80s, were partly motivated by architects, were motivated by an attempt to escape from the influence of Western modernism, because modernism was so dominant. They were trying to find other vernacular models that might provide another basis for a different kind of architecture. So someone like Hiroshi Hara was very instrumental in, very central to the idea of looking at vernaculars in Japan and in other countries that would escape European, would be models that would allow them to escape European modernism.
I think another question just appeared.
So this question, I'll read it out. You brought out an interesting dichotomy between unintentional design versus deliberate design. Why do you think Japan, or Tokyo specifically, has so much more eccentricities as compared to a city like London? Well, again, I'm not the right person to ask for a comparison between Tokyo and London. Culturally speaking, I think Japan and the United Kingdom are very similar. They're island countries at the edge of a continent, and they're full of weird, eccentric people. And most people are very polite and careful and pragmatic, but amongst them there's a sprinkling of very, very wild eccentrics. So I actually think if you say London doesn't have the eccentricities that Tokyo has, I would say go out and do some street observation, and maybe you might be surprised. I'm guessing. So.
Yes.
Yeah, we think so.
Yeah. But I think as you concluded your lecture, I think the question is more, all these practices are really about a curation of the urban environment, a question of choice, of selection of what you select to see and to show. So it's not that there are more oddities in Japan than elsewhere. It's just a question of gaze, of interest. So I think any one of you could find a similar kind of oddities anywhere else in the world. It's part of our personal work and research too. Any other questions? Otherwise, we'll...
Hi, Louise, sorry, I have one. I don't know, I tried to raise a hand, but I don't know if it's...
Sorry, excuse me. Dude, Alvaro.
Well, Thomas, thank you very much for the lecture. It was fantastic. But looking at the sort of ways in which they were observing these moments, I wonder if any of the groups were engaging more with film, as mostly we have seen drawings and photographs. But there is this element of walking around, no, that you were talking about, that was important for them. I wonder if film became anything relevant for any of the groups. As in the act, it was more like a movie night around the city, no? And the camera sometimes is more fixed and the drawings more static.
Yes, obviously back in 1986, film involved very large cameras and very expensive film, so they weren't doing any filming. But now, of course, filming is so much cheaper and easier. Anyone can do it with a smartphone. That certainly there are younger groups who are still doing similar street observation studies who do work with film. So if I had longer, I could have talked about some of the more recent work. But I would say simply for practical reasons, film wasn't a big, wasn't a possibility in the early days. Now it's a much easier thing to achieve. But I also think that certainly in the case of ROJO, it was about capturing a moment. It was about this kind of frozen, it was literally a still freeze frame of a particular ephemeral, beautiful moment that might never be repeated and might disappear tomorrow. So, in fact, I think the still photograph really suited a lot of the early work. And then when it became more architectural with people like Bow-Wow, it became the diagram, the hardline axonometric with no variation in line weight and so on. And now I think there are people working with the available digital technology to study things in a more dynamic way using film.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
As we didn't notice, actually, Alvaro's raised hand, is anyone raising a hand to ask the question? Because I didn't notice. I'm so sorry. Anyone has a last question, maybe?
Hello. I wanted to join the conversation, but actually the question I wanted to do has already been made, and I'm sorry for the wrong message there, but I was interested. Thank you very much for your inspiring lecture, and I was really interested in the fact if they also did outside the city, and they also joined the villages circumstance, and they made a reflection also about that, but the question was already made by Gabriel. Yeah, I think it's an incredible work, and at the same time ask myself, how could they have done this work, especially in the photographic media, and the way, in the sense, I mean, it's quite complicated. I work as an architect and as a photographer, and I realize it's complicated to join the two medias in the same one, because as we already said, like street photography mainly has people to be part of the images, and they made a research that is completely focused on just specific elements or specific details and buildings, and there is no kind of human figure appearing. So yeah, that was more like a comment or a reflection than a real question. But, so thank you.
Copy, go here, refresh.
Thank you. If no one else, just the last question from Takeko, just as reference to arts in Japan. Richard Wentworth, Making Do and Getting By, and Belgium Solution. Not sure who this is by, but
there is a Facebook group.
Okay. Well, we'll check this. Thank you, Takeko.
It's a book as well, I think. It's called like Belgian Solutions or Belgian Ugly Houses or something. And now they have like 2 books where they have all of these photographs that are very similar or inspired, I think, by this ROJO movement. So.
It's artists from Belgium or architects from Belgium. Do you know them?
No, I think it's just like a book where, like, I think it started as a Facebook group or something, and now it's a book where they just put all of these photographs inside. But like in Belgium, you can buy it in most like bookshops, and it's like these 2 books that just have all of these like super weird house situations that supposedly can happen only in Belgium. But yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Somebody asked where they can find archival information about ROJO. So I think if you look for books on Fujimori, the architect, many of the books will have a section on ROJO. I recommend my book that was announced at the beginning of this lecture, which also contains quite a lot of material about Wajirō Kon and about ROJO. So you'll find a big selection of Kon's original drawings in there and photographs of ROJO objects on several pages on that.
Yes, a question, a curiosity of myself is, because I didn't find, is the book Modernology by Wajirō Kon still available, or was it ever translated into English? Is there any access of this material?
It was never translated. And the books, if you look on antique book dealers, you can find copies. I just, when I was preparing this lecture, I Googled it and I found a couple of people selling it online. Of course, if you buy the 1930 version, it's very expensive. But Fujimori himself wrote a book called An Introduction to Modernology, only in Japanese, which is kind of a summary and explanation and contextualization of Kon's work. But there's very little writing about any of this in English. So that's a gap I'm trying to fill. I'm trying to introduce work that's probably just unavailable to people who don't read Japanese.
Yes, and that's wonderful. We discovered actually this thanks to your recent publication, and it's wonderful. I think it's still too confidential in Western culture, and we really encourage people to discover all of this history. But anyway, I wanted to say to everyone that we will publish this lecture on our website, our various canal of informations. You will, in a couple of days, probably next week, you will be able to watch this lecture again. We will send the information on Facebook,
our social media.
Yeah. So
we will put it on YouTube, but we will relate the address through our website and social media.
Anyway, if there are no more questions, I would really like to thank Thomas for this inspiring lecture. I think all of our students and people who joined really discovered a real inspiring approach also to the urban environment, and this is something we really try to do in our unit. So we'll invite you at the end of the day of the year to see also what we collected among all of us. Thank you so much, Thomas, and we hope to see you soon again.
Thank you, Thomas.